Hey everyone, Nick Manning here, and today I'm going to be doing a talking head video about integration testing and what you need to implement a proper integration test. So in the next video that I'll post soon, we'll go through step-by-step in code how to implement things physically, but I want to really make sure people understand these intermediate concepts. So this video is for intermediate developers. It's not for junior developers. I'm just giving you a disclaimer here. And if you're new to the channel, my name's Nick, and I teach Flutter in my free time. And I have a website, fluttercrashcourse.com, where I have like a number of different courses that you can take depending on your skill level. So what is an integration test? All an integration test is a test that runs in an actual device, on an actual device or a simulator, and it starts up your app and it will simulate a user tapping around your app, transitioning to different screens and ensuring that like the right stuff appears on the screen, right? An integration test is really important for any, app that you're submitting to the App Store, because you want to ensure that the app can at least start up without crashing, especially if you're using external libraries that can cause issues at startup, that the configuration you're using in your app, when you inject configuration to your app, doesn't cause a problem, and also that the transitions to and from screens work smoothly, and what you expect to appear on the screen shows up on the screen, right? This is different than widget or unit testing. Widget and unit testing is something different, where you're testing individual components in an atomic way. So that's not covered in this video, and that's another type of testing that's great. But I would say if you have very minimal time, at least implementing basic integration test will cover a lot of bases, and I typically implement an integration test when I'm starting out any app. So how do mocking and repositories enter into integration testing? So let me just first walk through a typical integration testing example, right? Let's say I have an e-commerce app on my iPhone or Android phone, for example. I'm a guest user and I open the e-commerce app and I just want to see a list of products to me as a guest user, right? An integration test would simulate all of that, ensuring that the products appear, right? Another integration test I could have ensures that the user logs in and then shows a customized list of products, maybe based on my user profile, right? So the reason why we need mocking, this is the second concept I'm talking about, is because when we rely on external services in our integration tests, our tests can become unpredictable and flaky. So for example, when I have a call to get all products for my integration test, and I'm calling out to an external web service to get those products, what if that external web service is down? It doesn't work at the moment. My test will just randomly fail. Second, what if that external web service changes how and what data is returned? All of a sudden my test will fail. That's important to know if it'll break my app, if it does change that data, but I want the test to be predictable, right? And third, like if I'm, if I want to test different scenarios, it's very hard to test those different scenarios using the external service. If I'm using mocks, I can simulate different types of data being returned based on the state of the user, right? And the last reason, and this is debatable, but a lot of people usually like to avoid relying on external services with integration tests because they take a long time to run, right? There's things that you need to set up, and making callouts to different external services, it's tedious, right? And it could take a lot of time. So that's just the typical explanation of an integration test. So how does mocking come into play? Well, mocking lets us simulate what gets returned from those external services. And so if I have like, that example I just gave you, where you have a user that's a guest user that logs in, or a user with a session that logs in, I can return different types of products, and those mocks will give me that sample data. So the last concept I want to touch on in this video is our repositories, or the repository pattern. And repositories aren't anything super exotic. All repositories do is ensure that you're abstracting away your data access, the logic that accesses data. That data could be accessed from a database on the device. It could be accessed from a web service API. But what you want to do is cleanly separate the code that accesses that data and the code that is doing other stuff, like rendering your user interface or something else. So a repository, all that is a class that has a number of methods in it that where the person calling those methods, they don't have to worry about the underlying logic on how to get that data. They're functions that say, here, with these parameters, give me the data I need. And you don't have to, the person calling that function, those functions, they don't have to worry about databases, APIs, etc. So if you're working with a team, that's really helpful. But also it makes your code very clean because you're not mucking up your code with that logic. You're pushing it off to one side. So using the repository pattern, we can have a repository, one repository in our app that actually calls the web services or databases we need. And we can have a mock repository, or a repository that returns hard-coded data. And that's what our mocks are. Those are what our mocks are. So I'll run through an example integration test with you now using, just verbally. I'm just going to explain how those mocking repositories work in my integration test, right? So when my integration test starts, I start on my app and I instantiate a mock repository instance, not an actual repository instance. And it's just a variable. It's a mock repository. And as I kind of load up a screen, I can inject that mock repository as a parameter to like the screen's constructor. And that screen can use that mock repository, right? And it will not know that it is a mock repository or not, right? Because the logic that's used doesn't differentiate between the two. All it knows is, hey, I want to render myself. I'm a screen, and please pass in whatever repository you'd like to use. So when you look at the code for that screen, there's no kind of like logic that says like, here, call this mock repository or call this real repository. It's passed in. So that gets into more concepts that I'm not going to touch on now, like dependency injection. But that's just basically, in all practical purposes, how we inject either real repositories or mock repositories in our screens. So the integration test would basically load all the products, load the first screen, and let's say if it wants to show all the products, it'll show all those products as a guest, and the mock repository will return all those guest products. And then let's say I sign in. I'm actually going to sign in with a user, a mock user, right? And then it will show, let's say, customized products it wants to return. So that will use that mock repository. We can make a call to that, passing in this user object, and that mock repository can return a different set of hard-coded products because of the fact that we're logged in. It's simulating an actual call to a web service, for example. So, and then, the integration test would, we would click around and interact with the app, making sure that the data we want shows up on the screen, and then we finish the test, and hopefully the test passes. So that's an overview on integration testing. I urge you to subscribe to my channel if you want to learn more about intermediate Flutter tutorials. I usually switch things off from week to week. So some weeks I'll do a step-by-step code overview and explain some code with a test project, and other times I'll just explain something that are concepts or something like that. So I hope you learned something today, and thanks for watching.